On May 25, 2017, at the gleaming new NATO headquarters in Brussels, Belgium, something happened that had never occurred in the 70-year history of the world's most powerful military alliance. Standing before the leaders of America's closest allies, prime ministers, presidents, and chancellors who had gathered for a ceremonial unveiling of memorials to the September 11th attacks and Article 5, NATO's mutual defense commitment, Donald Trump delivered a speech that shocked the diplomatic world. He didn't offer the traditional reassurances about transatlantic unity or America's unwavering commitment to collective defense. Instead, he scolded America's allies publicly, telling them bluntly that many NATO countries owe massive amounts of money and that the United States would no longer tolerate what he characterized as freeloading. The speech lasted only a few minutes, but it represented a seismic shift in how an American president talked about the alliance that had anchored Western security since 1949. This was Trump's NATO ultimatum, and it would define his entire approach to the alliance and reshape the transatlantic relationship in ways that continue reverberating today. Trump's challenge to NATO didn't begin in Brussels. It started during the 2016 campaign, when he called the alliance obsolete in interviews, questioned whether the United States should automatically defend NATO members who didn't meet their defense spending obligations, and suggested that America's allies were taking advantage of U.S. protection without paying their fair share. These statements horrified foreign policy establishment figures in both parties who had spent decades treating NATO as sacred, as the cornerstone of American global leadership and the institutional embodiment of the West's triumph in the Cold War. But Trump approached NATO the way a business might approach a partnership agreement that he believed was one-sided and unfavorable. He saw the alliance not as an ideological commitment or a geopolitical necessity, but as a deal that needed to be renegotiated because America wasn't getting sufficient value for its investment. The fundamental issue Trump raised was real, even if diplomatic protocol had traditionally kept American presidents from discussing it so bluntly. In 2014, NATO members had agreed at a summit in Wales that each country should spend at least 2% of its gross domestic product on defense, a target meant to ensure that the alliance maintained credible military capabilities and that burden sharing was more equitable. But by the time Trump took office in 2017, only 5 of NATO's then 28 members were meeting this commitment: the United States, the United Kingdom, Greece, Estonia, and Poland. Major European powers, including Germany, France, Italy, Spain, and Canada, were all spending significantly less than 2%, with some countries spending barely 1% of GDP on defense. The United States, meanwhile, was spending over 3.5% of its GDP on defense and providing the vast majority of NATO's military capabilities, from air power to intelligence to nuclear deterrence. Trump's business background shaped how he interpreted this disparity. He genuinely believed that America was being played for a sucker, that wealthy European countries were spending money on generous social programs while relying on American taxpayers to fund their defense. In Trump's view, this wasn't an abstract policy debate about burden sharing or alliance management. It was a straightforward question of fairness and reciprocity. Why should American workers subsidize the defense of countries that were wealthy enough to pay for their own security but chose not to? Trump translated complex questions of alliance strategy into the language of deals and payments, telling audiences that NATO countries owe America money, and he was going to collect. This framing drove foreign policy experts crazy because it fundamentally misrepresented how NATO financing works, but it resonated with Trump's supporters, who felt that America too often got the short end of international agreements.
The reality of NATO financing is more complex than Trump's rhetoric suggested, though his core point about burden sharing had merit. NATO doesn't operate like a business where countries pay dues to a central organization that then provides defense. Instead, each country maintains its own military and commits to collective defense, meaning an attack on one is treated as an attack on all. The 2% target refers to national defense spending, not payments to NATO itself. Countries weren't literally owing the United States money, as Trump sometimes suggested, but they were failing to invest in their own military capabilities at levels they had agreed to, which meant America had to maintain larger and more expensive forces to compensate. Trump's transactional language obscured these details, but he succeeded in forcing a conversation about burden sharing that previous American presidents had raised more diplomatically with minimal results. At that Brussels summit in 2017, Trump's confrontational approach immediately created tension. During a private meeting with NATO leaders, Trump reportedly delivered an even blunter version of his public message, criticizing specific countries by name and questioning why the United States should defend allies who weren't meeting their commitments. German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who had become the de facto leader of the European Union and represented the country Trump criticized most frequently, left the summit and gave a speech suggesting that Europe could no longer completely rely on America and needed to take its fate into its own hands. The comment was widely interpreted as a response to Trump and a recognition that the transatlantic relationship had fundamentally changed. For the first time since World War II, a German leader was publicly suggesting that European countries needed to prepare for a world where American protection might not be guaranteed. Trump's NATO challenge intensified at the July 2018 summit in Brussels, which became one of the most contentious gatherings in the alliance's history. Behind closed doors, Trump reportedly told allies that if they didn't increase defense spending, the United States might go it alone and not come to their defense. He singled out Germany for particular criticism, noting that Germany was spending heavily on a natural gas pipeline from Russia, while spending less than promised on defense, calling the situation totally inappropriate. The pipeline issue, Nord Stream 2, became a recurring flashpoint between Trump and Merkel, with Trump arguing that Germany was making itself dependent on Russian energy, while simultaneously failing to maintain adequate defenses against Russian aggression. Trump's critics accused him of being overly sympathetic to Russia, but on this specific issue, Trump was raising concerns about European energy policy that many American officials from both parties shared, even if they expressed them more diplomatically. The public drama of the 2018 summit overshadowed what was actually happening behind the scenes. NATO countries were starting to increase their defense spending significantly. Between 2016 and 2020, European allies and Canada added more than $130 billion in additional defense spending, the largest increase in a generation. Multiple countries that had been far below the 2% target announced plans to reach it within a few years. Whether this happened because of Trump's pressure or would have occurred anyway due to concerns about Russian aggression following the 2014 annexation of Crimea remains debated, but Trump certainly believed his confrontational approach deserved credit. At a press conference during the 2018 summit, Trump declared victory, saying countries had agreed to increase spending like they've never increased before because of his demands. Trump's approach to NATO revealed a fundamental philosophical difference between his view of alliances and the view that had governed American foreign policy since World War II. The traditional bipartisan consensus held that NATO served American interests not just by providing military capabilities, but by creating a stable, democratic, prosperous Europe that didn't require constant American intervention to prevent wars. The alliance was seen as foundational infrastructure for American global leadership, worth maintaining even if burden sharing wasn't perfectly equitable. Trump rejected this framework, or at least questioned whether the benefits justified the costs. He saw NATO through a more transactional lens. If allies wanted American protection, they needed to pay for it proportionally. This wasn't isolationism exactly. Trump never seriously proposed withdrawing from NATO, but it was a conditional commitment that many allies nervous about American reliability.